If you've been outside of the US for more than 1 year and you try to come back, you need to bring evidence that it was not your intent to remain outside of the US for that long, unless you got the re-entry permit, in which case you have permission. What will typically happen is they'll bring you into a back room. It's called secondary inspection, and they will interview you to determine whether you intended to live outside of the US for that long. For those of you who are new to my channel, I'm Puyan Darian, an attorney focused entirely on immigration law, and I try to focus on family-based immigration. Today I want to talk about returning to the US as a permanent resident after you've been outside of the US for several years, continuously. So this creates a lot of problems. First of all, there's a general presumption that if you leave the US with your green card for more than 1 year continuously, you've abandoned your permanent residence. But this is just a presumption. That means it can be overcome. And there are many issues pertaining to this. And I want to talk about this in several different aspects today. The first thing that you should think about if you're a permanent resident and you know that you need to leave the US for more than 1 year continuously is a re-entry permit. You would apply for permission to depart the US for more than 1 year, and you do this by filing Form I-131, application for a re-entry permit. You have to do it while you're in the US. You have to go for your biometrics fingerprinting appointment in the US, and then you could depart the US. And let's say you're from Mexico. The US government will eventually send a re-entry permit to the US Embassy in Mexico. You would go and pick it up. You'll be notified when it's available. And then a year or two later, you use that document to re-enter the US, and there will be no claim of abandonment. Let's say there is a claim of abandonment. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is, if you're outside of the US for a very long time and you try to re-enter, the customs officers who you're dealing with are the ones who will typically allege that you've abandoned your residency. And this will play out in a couple different ways. The general rule is that if you've been outside of the US for more than 1 year and you try to come back, you need to bring evidence that it was not your intent to remain outside of the US for that long, unless you got the re-entry permit, in which case you have permission. But let's say you don't have a re-entry permit. And I think the easiest way to explain this is with an example. Let's say you're a citizen of Mexico and you're a permanent resident of the United States. You have your green card. And your plan is to go to Mexico for 6 months to visit family and come back. But you get stuck in Mexico. And through no fault of your own, you're stuck there for 13 months. And you want to come back, but you just can't for 13 months, whether flights are canceled or there's another like COVID outbreak or whatever. You're stuck in Mexico. When you try to come back after 13 months of being outside of the US, the customs officers should flag you for abandonment. What will typically happen is they'll bring you into a back room. It's called secondary inspection, and they will interview you to determine whether you intended to live outside of the US for that long. If you can bring evidence that you actually didn't intend to depart for that long and that you maintained a permanent address in the US, then the officer may determine that you actually retained your permanent residency and admit you normally as a permanent resident. Your problem will be somewhat fixed for now. But let's say the immigration officer doesn't believe that you intended to retain your residency. They believe that you were just permanently living in Mexico for 13 months and now you've changed your mind and you want to come back to the US and live here permanently. Well, if the immigration officer actually believes that, what will typically happen is they'll try to get you to sign Form I-407, a voluntary abandonment of your permanent residency. And I've seen immigration officers say stuff to my clients like, yeah, it'll be fine, just sign this. It'll go a long way when you try to apply for permanent residence again. But what they don't explain is that oftentimes you don't have a pathway to becoming a permanent resident again, especially if a family member previously petitioned for you and that's how you became a permanent resident, and that family member is dead or they were a spouse and you're divorced and you don't have a qualifying family member to help you become a permanent resident again. The customs officers oftentimes aren't well versed in some of these issues, so you really need to speak to a lawyer before you sign anything, especially Form I-407. What happens if you refuse to sign the form? Well, at that point, the immigration officer can give you a notice to appear in immigration court, and they will admit you into the US. Not admit, they will allow you into the US. Admit is a very specific term, and they probably aren't admitting you. They're allowing you to enter just for purposes of going to your immigration court proceedings. They might also parole you into the US, which will give you more options down the road. Okay, so now let's look at a more concrete example. Let's say you have a green card and you have been outside of the US for 3 years now, and you realize you need to come back. It was a mistake to be out for that long. What should you do? Well, generally speaking, I mean, you need to talk to an immigration lawyer. That's what you should do. But aside from talk to an immigration lawyer, I want you to understand the general situation here. When you try to come back, you need to bring as much evidence as possible that you didn't intend to stay outside of the US for that long, and that you maintained a permanent residence inside the United States. So back to that little story I told about how the customs officer will bring you to a back room for a secondary inspection to interview you. A lot of those interview questions are going to be asking about where have you been working for the last few years? Where have you been receiving mail? Have you been filing tax returns? Have you maintained stuff in the US? Like, do you have a car? Do you have property? Do you have insurance in the US? Are you receiving mail in the US? The purpose of all these questions is to see if you still have a life inside the US, because to maintain your permanent residence, you must continuously intend to permanently reside in the US. But if it looks like you've been starting a whole new life outside of the US for the last 3 years, you bought a bunch of property. Let's say you're from Mexico, you moved there for 3 years, you bought a bunch of property, you started a new family there, you get all your mail there, you have a job there. Now it really looks like you have not intended to return to the US within a reasonable amount of time, and that you intend to permanently live outside of the US. I will generally recommend to try to salvage the permanent residency before we take any further action. What does further action look like? Let's say you've been outside of the US for 20 years and you've had a green card for 20 years and you really didn't plan on ever coming back, but circumstances have changed and now you want to come back. Well, first of all, the first thing I would do is analyze the situation to see, even though 20 years have passed, is there evidence that you intended to retain a permanent address in the US or intended to come back and it was through no fault of your own that you weren't able to? Sometimes it happens. It would probably be rare, but we might be able to figure out a way to do that. Otherwise, we would need a way to reapply for your permanent residence. For example, let's say after 20 years of being outside of the US, you now want to get married with a US citizen and you want to eventually move back to the US as a permanent resident. What you would generally need to do there is file I-407 to abandon your permanent residence and then begin the family petition process all over again. You would get married or file a fiancé petition, and after you get married, your US citizen spouse will petition for you and you'll go through the consular process to re-enter the US as a new permanent resident. There's also something called a returning resident visa, an SB1. That's beyond the scope of this video, and that is not going to apply if you've been outside of the US for 20 years. Sometimes in some of my videos, I explain how you could do things without a lawyer and when you really need a lawyer. This would be a situation where you really need a lawyer. Legal analysis is required here to see whether we can salvage your old green card or whether we need to abandon it and reapply. Abandoning, signing that I-407 is a very serious step. I would never do that under any circumstance without first speaking with an attorney who's well versed in immigration law. If this is an issue you're dealing with, check out the link in the details of the video below for instructions on how to schedule a consultation. I'll be more than happy to meet with you and figure out what's best for you and your family. All right, guys, that's it for today's video. I'll see you guys next week for another one.